Chapter 40, The Flatterer and His Net. The boys were talking together about little Faith and his troubles when they came to a place where a road led out of the way of the king in such a manner that it was very difficult to see which path was the right one. If you stood on one side of the road, the right-hand path seemed to be straight, but if you crossed over to the other side, the left-hand path looked quite straight also. "I don't know which is right," said Christian, and they stood still to consider. Now the shepherds had given the children a little map, and if they had looked at it, they would have seen at once which path to take. But instead of doing this, they began to waste their time by crossing the road from side to side, trying to find out for themselves which was the straightest of the two paths. Presently a man came up behind them. His face was dark and ugly, but he wore a white robe, and the children supposed that he was a pilgrim. "What is the matter?" he asked. "You seem to be very puzzled." "Oh," replied Christian, "we are going to the king's city, and we cannot make out which of these paths is the right one." The man laughed. "Is that all?" he said. "You need not look so troubled about it. I'm going to the celestial city myself. Follow me, and I will show you the way." So without waiting to be sure that the man was really a pilgrim, Christian and Hopeful followed him. But very soon they discovered their mistake, for instead of looking toward the celestial city, they found that they were going back to the Delectable Mountains. "This path is not straight, I'm sure," exclaimed Christian. Hopeful stopped at once. "Don't you think it is?" he said in a frightened voice. "No, we ought to be looking the other way. See, there are the hills where we were walking from this morning. This path is leading us back to them." "That man has deceived us," said Hopeful. "We must turn back again." "But perhaps he will run after us and kill us. He cannot be a real pilgrim." "I don't know," said Christian. "I wish we had not followed him. Let's run away." The boys turned around hastily, but at that very moment the man turned also, and before they had time to take a single step towards the way of the king, they found themselves entangled in a large net which he had thrown over them. They fell upon the ground, crying out loud for help, but the man only laughed and walked away. Then his white robe slipped off his shoulders, and they saw he was a servant of the wicked prince, and had dressed himself like a pilgrim in order to deceive anyone who would listen to him. Christian and Hopeful struggled hard to free themselves from the dreadful net, but the more they pulled at it, the tighter it became, and at last they were forced to lie still, crying together and thinking how foolish they had been. "That man must have been the Flatterer," said Christian, "and the shepherd told us not to listen to him." "Yes," said Hopeful, "and we never looked at the map which they gave us." "We are very bad pilgrims," sobbed Christian. "We are always doing naughty things. If only the king will save us this once, I don't think we shall ever be foolish again." Chapter 41. The little pilgrims are rescued by the Shining One. The little pilgrims began to fear that they would have to spend the night beneath the net of the Flatterer. "And, perhaps," said Christian, "he's gone to tell the wicked prince, and he will send his soldiers to carry us away." Just when the sun was setting, the children heard footsteps coming nearer and nearer, and even Hopeful could not help trembling. But only one man came in sight, and they knew by his shining garments and gentle face that he was really one of the king's true servants. When he saw the little pilgrims, he stopped. "How did you get into this net?" he asked. "We were puzzled," said Christian, "and we could not make out which way to take. Then a man with a white robe came to us and told us he was going to the celestial city, so we followed him." "It was a Flatterer," said the king's servant, and then he stooped down and tore the net in pieces. Christian and Hopeful were soon able to creep out of it, and they stood upright on the path before him, waiting until he should tell them what to do. His face was grave, and Christian remembered how Evangelist had looked at him in the same way when he found him wandering among the terrible rocks. The Shining One turned toward the way of the king and bade the boys come after him. Christian slipped his hand into Hopeful's, and they walked on together. When they were once more in the right path, the Shining One stopped. "Where did you sleep last night?" he asked. "With the shepherds upon the mountains." "Did they not give you a little map of your way?" "Yes," said the boys, and they hung their heads, for they felt very much ashamed. "Did you look at your map when you were puzzled?" No, whispered Hopeful, and Christian added, we forgot. And what else did the shepherds say to you? Did they warn you about the flatterer? They told us we were not to listen to him. And yet you did listen to them. How was that? We did not think that that man could be the flatterer because he spoke so kind to us. The tears were now running down the little pilgrim's cheeks, and the Shining One laid his hands upon their shoulders and spoke gently. You've been very foolish, she said, but I think you are sorry. We are very, very sorry, sobbed poor little Christian, and it was more my fault than Hopeful's. No, said the Shining One, you were both wrong. If the king had not sent me to look for you, you might have been killed or carried away by the soldiers of the wicked prince. But although the king had sent his servant to seek for the lost children and to bring them back into the right path, he was not pleased, and he had commanded the Shining One to punish them for their foolishness. The king will forgive you, he said, but I shall be obliged to punish you because you have now been pilgrims for a long time, and you would not have lost your way if you had done as the shepherd told you. Then Christian and Hopeful saw that he held a little whip in his hand, and with this he struck them both many times. The strokes of the whip hurt them very much, but they knew that they deserved their punishment. When it was over, the Shining One told them that the king would not remember their naughtiness any more. Our dear prince, he said, was once a pilgrim, and he has not forgotten the dangers and difficulties of the way. He's always watching over you, and when you are careless, he begs his father to forgive you for his sake. Chapter 42, Unbelief. After the Shining One had left them, the little pilgrims went steadily on their way, and for 2 or 3 days they met with neither friend nor enemy. They were now crossing a very wide plain, which lay between the Delectable Mountains and a beautiful country with low hills and long valleys, which was marked upon their map as the Land of Delight. Part of the plain was called the Enchanted Ground, and Hopeful reminded Christian that the shepherds had warned them not to fall asleep there. I had not forgotten, said Christian, but I am glad you remembered too. We must be very careful now, for after all this long journey, it would be dreadful if we were carried away like that poor little pilgrim whom we saw the other day. We will not listen to any more flatterers, said Hopeful. Is there not a man upon the road before us now? Yes, said Christian, and his face is turned away from the celestial city. He must be coming to meet us. I don't think he's one of the Shining Ones, said Hopeful, as the man drew near. No, he has pilgrim's dress, but he's walking the wrong way. The man, whose name was Unbelief, stopped when he met the children and asked them where they were going. He had a pleasant face, and his voice was gentle, but the boys knew that they must not trust his words. We're going to the celestial city, the city of the king, said Christian, in answer to his question. Unbelief laughed. You poor little fellows, he said. Have you really traveled all this long way without finding out the truth? What truth? Asked Hopeful. It is such a tiresome journey, continued Unbelief, and if you ever get to the end of it, you will only be disappointed. Why? Then Unbelief pretended to look sad. There is no king, he said, and no celestial city. Oh, but there is, said Christian. We have heard about it from the king's own servant. Unbelief put his hand upon the boy's shoulder and tried to turn him around. My dear child, you are quite young, and I am growing old. Listen to what I have to say. Long, long ago, I heard the very same story which was told to you. I left my home and came to look for the king's city. Well, said Christian, you will find it soon, will you not? No, said Unbelief. I have been much farther than you have. I have spent 20 years as a pilgrim, and I can find no city at all. Then Christian turned to Hopeful with a very sorrowful face. Oh, do you think he's telling the truth? No, said Hopeful. I'm sure he's not. Do not listen to him. You know, we saw the city from the Delectable Mountains. Let us make haste, or the Shining One will have to punish us again. Unbelief stood by, watching the two boys. Come back with me, he said, and I will take you safely to your own homes again. But Christian answered him bravely, You are trying to deceive us, but we do not believe what you say. We are quite sure that the king's word is true, and that there is a celestial city. We saw its gates when we were with the shepherds." Unbelief shook his head. "You are mistaken, but you can go and look for it. I'm going back to my own country." "And we're going to the king," replied Christian. So they went on again, and Unbelief laughed at them as he turned away.